all for spending a little time with us this afternoon. Thanks to the Y for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here and get a chance to talk to you a little bit about my research. So I'm going to be sharing findings from my 5th book, African Women, ICT, and Neoliberal Politics. So what is ICT? Who knows what ICT is? Raise your hand. Yes. What is it?
Information, communications, technology.
Exactly. So by ICT, we're talking about mobile phones, we're talking about access to computers, the internet, that kind of thing. And today what I want to do is to share with you a brief overview of the thesis of my book concerning the multiplicative effect and gendered nature of digital divides. And also, I'll examine a new model for understanding the impact of the knowledge economy and gender-sensitive definitions of good governance. And in my intro, I will cover the topics that you see on the screen. So I had the distinct honor to participate in a symposium to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the release of the late Professor Victor Uchendo's The Igbo of Southeastern Nigeria. As former president of the African Studies Association, Professor Uchendo has left a long legacy of fields into the fields of anthropology, sociology, and of course, African studies. He was the founding director of the Center for African Studies here at the University of Illinois, and he served there from 1971 through 1980, and thus produced a generation of African studies scholars. Professor Uchendo wrote from an emic or insider's perspective. He indicated that he wrote about Igbo society and culture as a full participant and as a man of science. Some scholars challenged the value of Uchendo gathering data as a full participant. The veracity of the data and the objectivity of the analyst was questioned by them. Positivists purport that social science must be scientific in the sense of physical and experimental sciences, and they also claim that research must be value-free. However, we know that given our limited points of view, value-free research is often, and I would say always, an unachievable ideal. Dominant groups are especially poorly equipped to identify oppressive features of their own beliefs and practices, according to Sandra, Harding, and Norbert. And standpoint methodologists have argued this as well. Their activities, meaning dominant groups' activities, in daily life do not provide them with the intellectual and political resources necessary to detect such values and interests in their own work. So feminists report that not only is value-free research unachievable, but it's actually an undesirable goal. Professor Uchendo was a part of the post-positivist movement and held himself accountable to African audiences and disadvantaged groups. Some well-known anti-positivists were Max Weber and W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois wrote at length about double consciousness, the quintessential representation of not only the conflict between insider and outsider perspectives, but also the African and African diaspora scholar as embodiment of both perspectives. Now, with interpretive approaches, many have dispensed with the ideal of value-free social science. Due to the work of Du Bois, Uchendo, Harding, Collins, and others, insiders' perspectives are now valued among growing numbers of contemporary social scientists. Uchendo's dissertation committee challenged his desire to write about the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. Though he completed a groundbreaking dissertation on Native American cultural anthropology, Uchendo never abandoned his passion and completed his first book on the Igbo culture with several others to follow. Writing from his emic perspective, Uchendo inspired a generation of scholarship considered to be foundational texts within African studies. And some of the scholars that he encouraged and supported and inspired include Professor Ife Amadiume, and I've listed some of her works there, and a number of other prominent Africanists today. Both Uchendo and Amadiume wrote from an emic perspective about their beloved Nigeria, West Africa. While my work is not largely qualitative, I too, like Uchendo and Amadiume and others, seek to write as a full participant, as a citizen of the Pan-African world who takes the issues of women in development very personally, and as a woman of science. In other works, I've written at length about my scholar-activist orientation to my intellectual work. And just like Uchendo and others, I've persisted despite many barriers. Following the legacies of Anna Julia Cooper, Audre Lorde, and contemporary scholars such as Amadiume, I center the concerns of African women activists and scholars in my work. African feminism articulates women-centered perspectives that describe intersecting oppressions and privileges of women's and girls' lives, as well as the social structures in which they are situated. In past work, I've developed an African feminist methodology. This methodology aids my examination of African feminist thought, and I'm especially interested at this moment at the mechanisms that impede the development of that thought and that decelerate its uptake, namely digital inequality. This excludes women on the African continent and in the diaspora and creates barriers to communal discourse and problem solving. Leaving African women out of the conversation may be partly responsible for the pervasiveness of neoliberalism today, I argue. I've also argued that pursuing African feminism provides an opportunity to create intellectual tools to build toward social justice instead of reproducing master narratives. Without the intellectual diversity that African feminism offers, capital expansion and subsequent development, even in the wake of social protest, morphs into something not liberatory, but unfortunately predatory. In some well-endowed contexts, information technology promises to contribute to enhanced availability of some kinds of knowledge. But in these spaces, I continue to see disparate access, especially along the lines of educational background, language, and age. Some drivers of innovation aim to provide open source materials. In emerging markets, principles of neoliberal market-driven expansion trump any efforts to ensure non-discrimination and access to mobile technology. African feminist principles offer an alternative perspective in line with the values of social justice, inclusion, and equitable access to technology. However, digital inequality is a major concern of our times. The experiences of African women and post-colonial feminist scholarship provide unique perspectives on ICT. We must emphasize the voices of women and demonstrate how their framings are important when examining science and technology in society. When technology is inaccessible, digital divides result both in dire consequences for women on the African continent, but they also thwart the flow of knowledge among various scholarly communities transnationally. So here I'm arguing that not only do digital divides do damage to people in settings that have fewer resources, but us as scholars also suffer because we're not hearing the perspectives of women from other parts of the world, which means that our analyses are stunted. Africa is affected by structural and epistemic disparities that produce knowledge divides. The digital divide separates and marginalizes the global South, especially women in those settings, and digital inequality exacerbates existing gender inequalities. And also, importantly for us whose vocation is the production of knowledge, divides cut us off from the perspectives, epistemologies, and wisdoms of those with limited access to ICT. So one of the projects that I've been engaging in for the past few years is to create a database of African women's scholarship, where I have looked at institutions on the African continent, looked into those universities' websites, looked at the departments whose scholars may be producing work that would speak to mine, and just going through and making lists of those African women scholars. And then taking a look at their CVs, if they're available. They're on their websites, so that I can make sure I'm reading all of the sources that they've produced. Because unfortunately, in our Western databases, we're not capturing these scholars' work. I did an analysis where I took a look at the Sociological Abstracts database, Popline, and Medline, and I found that the majority of African women scholars who have 30 or more peer-reviewed publications listed on their university websites, that the majority did not have any publications listed in those Western databases. And so I'm in the process right now of creating a database of African women scholars. And I'm finding that it is having an amazing impact on my work and the ways that I'm thinking about these issues, and it's also influencing the work of my students and colleagues. And so I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about my analysis of ICT, looking at whether or not information and communication technologies have an impact on good governance in 3 countries. And I'm replicating a study that was conducted by Asangu and Nwachukwu in 2016. And in their study, they're using World Bank measures. And so in those World Bank measures, unfortunately, they're not looking at aspects of women's access to ICT or aspects of good governance that link up and are relevant in women's lives. And I was able to create that new model as a result of reading the work of African women scholars. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. So here we go. So Asangu and Nwachukwu, in their model, they posit that the proliferation of mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa has contributed to the diffusion of knowledge, which in turn has enhanced good governance. And so the way that their model looks is like this. They say that access to mobile subscriptions has a positive impact on the knowledge economy of a country, which has an impact on good governance. And so knowledge economy is the mechanism through which access to mobile phones is having a positive effect on good governance. And that's measured in terms of education. I went up a slide. In terms of education, the percentage of people who have access to the internet, and the number of patents. That's how they're measuring knowledge economy. And then good governance, they're looking at it in 3 ways: political governance, economic governance, and institutional governance. But as I said, this model is androcentric. That is my criticism of the model. And so here I chart out all the weaknesses of the aspects of their model. So here, it keeps going ahead here. The first box, mobile subscriptions, they look at mobile subscriptions for all people as opposed to what's going on specifically for women. Unfortunately, the data makes it very difficult for us to understand what's going on in terms of women's access to cell phones. Usually, this data is going to be pointing more so to men's access to cell phones. We have household data that sometimes provides this information, but again, the data just says, does the household have a cell phone? So you don't know if the woman owns it, the man owns it, if there are multiple wives in the household, if the wife that owns the phone is sharing it with the other women, and the research actually shows that in these households, usually the women that need the phones the most due to domestic violence, other issues happening in their lives, health challenges, they're the ones who are least likely to have them. So I was able to find a data set that provided me information on not only whether the woman's household has a cell phone, but whether she has one herself. So that's how I was able to tweak that part of the model. And then in the second box here, I showed the weaknesses in terms of education. They're looking at education broadly as opposed to looking at women's access to education. So male-female student ratios, for example, is something that's not considered, and women's completed education. In terms of innovation, they're looking at patents and trademarks, but not whether or not women are able to get those legal patents and issue those trademarks. And then finally, in terms of ICT, of course, it's women's access. And then in terms of good governance, again, global androcentric measures were used in Asangu and Nwachukwu's model. And in mine, what I do is I look at women's political activity. I look at women's economic access and whether or not intimate partner violence is being prosecuted in their countries. So this just shows everything that I looked at, which I just already went through. Oh, the other thing that I examined in my model is informal education. So the literature is showing that when women are using cell phones for banking, even though they may not have completed primary education, that they're able to use their cell phones to do internet banking, and that contributes to their literacy. So I looked at not only formal literacy, but informal, not only formal education, but also informal education. Okay. So I analyzed data from the Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Malawi Demographic and Health Survey. And I have the years that I have that data listed. And so I gathered the most recently available data. And these are the only 3 countries in the Demographic and Health Survey that have, African countries, that have information on individual women's cell phone ownership. So that's how I chose them. And I joined that data with the world governance indicators that Asangu and Nwachukwu used to create an analysis file. And so just to kind of describe the data a little bit, 64% of households owned mobile phones in 2015 or 16, depending on the year of the data, for all 3 countries. And that's households, not women. So on the next column there, 47% of women ages 15 to 49 owned cell phones in 2015 or 16. And you see it's variable by country, 35% in Malawi, 52% in Tanzania, and 72% in Zimbabwe. So in terms of some of the results, in terms of women's individual knowledge, mobile phones in women's households are associated with their literacy, their highest educational level, and their media consumption. And so this idea that the proliferation of cell phones is contributing to knowledge economy, let's wait an hour. There we go. Is contributing to the knowledge economy and people's individual knowledge. We find some support for that in this data set. Why do you think that the knowledge economy is an important part of, let me just go back here a quick second. Yeah, this middle part. Why do you think the mechanism of knowledge economy is an important linkage between ICT and good governance? What do you think is going on there? So it makes a little bit of sense that access to cell phones would have an impact on good governance, right? That makes a little sense to people. Why do you think that makes sense?
More information, more current events following.
Yes, so they can follow current events, they have more information. Anything else?
Perhaps an ability to question what they're being told.
Absolutely. They get multiple sources of information, and so a better ability to question. So all of those are things that contribute to this idea of the knowledge economy, right? That the higher quality the knowledge is.
I'm just, for the purpose of the recording.
Stay over there, okay. I'm in teaching mode, sorry. So the better access to higher quality knowledge, the more likely people are to speak back to their government in terms of what their expectations are, the more likely they are to vote, the more likely they are to become politically active, okay? And so this whole idea of individual knowledge is really important, because if you are being fed fake news about what's going on in your country, then it's going to be more difficult for you to make informed decisions and even care about being involved, right? So let's take a look at some of the knowledge economy results. So looking at mobile phones in homes and world governance indicators, mobile phones are associated with higher primary levels of education, lower pupil-student ratios, a gender parity index of 1, and higher percentages of individuals using the internet. So why do you think that those might have an impact on good governance? One, any, or multiple of those? Absolutely, yes, yes. And it's really interesting because the research is unclear as to the chicken and the egg there. You know, is the access to information creating better literacy, or do you need to have a certain standard level of literacy in order for the information to be useful? And so we're getting conflicting information there in terms of that. So countries with higher percentages of women with mobile accounts do have higher completed educational levels, higher literacy, and media consumption. And so again, we're not exactly sure what comes first, or if it's kind of cyclical, you know, that higher media consumption means higher literacy, means higher media consumption, that it's just continuing to feed off each other. Okay, so the first thing that I did was to replicate the findings from Asangu and Nwachukwu's study. And I found that mobile phones in women's households, and so this is not women themselves, this is in their households. So it kind of takes it up still up a level from what they did, but I wanted to keep it as close to what they did as possible. So I found that when women had mobile phones in their households, they lived in communities that had better coverage in terms of social safety net programs, that there was better equity in public resource use and quality of the public administration, that there were policies for social inclusion and equity, and more transparency and accountability, and also less corruption in the public sector. And so that was very consistent with Asangu and Nwachukwu's findings. Then I entered those women-centered variables to take a look to see what impact I saw there. And so here I was looking at whether or not women owned mobile phones and their knowledge diffusion and its impact on good governance. And I found that ownership of phones by women and higher levels of knowledge diffusion are related to whether or not laws in their communities mandate equal remuneration for equal work between males and females, whether or not legislation exists on domestic violence, if there is non-discrimination clauses in their constitution that includes gender, and also aspects of gender parity in education and females' primary school completion rates. So in this presentation, I've critically examined world development indicators and used the literature that came from African women scholars to think about better measures of what makes up good governance. And I have really called for an intervention by African women scholars by creating the database of African women scholars and promoting it. I've also applied an African feminist lens to the study conducted by Asangu and Nwachukwu and found that their model of good governance lacks factors that consider issues of gender equity, and also that ICT and knowledge diffusion must be measured in ways that considered women's access. So we need to pay attention to whether or not women have access to cell phones, whether or not women have access to the internet, and in terms of thinking about knowledge diffusion, their access to education, the quality of education that they're receiving relative to men, and also their access to other aspects of knowledge diffusion, including innovation. So in my book, what I do is I create a more inclusive definition of good governance that comes from this African feminist scholarship. And in my multivariate analysis, I find that more inclusive measures of improved governance and examining women's access to information and communication technologies produces more robust results. Thank you. So we have a question in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to say I really commend your comments and your efforts because women are really vital to economic development. I have worked in a number of those countries that you mentioned for USAID and World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And for the purpose of an American audience, I think it's important to say, you've been to 6 or 7 years, comment on it.
Mm-hmm.
About 90% of women are in rural areas.
Yes.
And of these, they're working in the fields.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have the education or the skills or the money to buy a cell phone. This is pretty far-fetched. I mean, they don't even have a bicycle. And they're in water on their heads.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real world. And so technology doesn't penetrate these areas, and that this is something that concerns me a great deal too.
Yeah.
But it's because they don't have basic education.
Mm-hmm.
And they have large families. Population growth in sub-Saharan Africa is enormous. The net population growth per capita, net economic growth has been negative for quite a while. It's turned positive just recently. But part of that is because of the Education for All effort that's gotten women into schools, and then they choose to have fewer children when they get up to 9th grade. And so I think that the cause and effect relationship, and this is now my question, what you're studying here, and this I commend you for it, I really do, is they don't have the skills to have a job in the urban economy and don't have the money to buy a cell phone. It's kind of simple.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you so much for your question. And so he's asking about whether women in rural areas have access to the education needed and jobs needed in order to be able to own cell phones, and talking about the fact that women's lack of access to the formal economy has a deleterious effect on cell phone ownership. And I was actually recently in Uganda, and fortunately I was able to spend some time in a rural area there. And actually, many more women are owning cell phones, and I was really surprised to see the amount of smartphones. I was like, wow, because you know I'm used to looking at data, and the data says that no one has smartphones, and believe me, they have them. So not necessarily in rural areas, but in urban areas. And actually, the main users of internet banking are women, whether they are in rural or urban areas. Because when husbands go off to urban areas or other countries, they're sending their remittances back with mobile banking. And so it's actually becoming an entree into literacy, financial literacy for women. So things are changing too slowly. It's always too slowly for us, but things are changing in that realm. But I agree with you. Of course, education is very important, but it's also important to appreciate traditional forms of education. and things that women know about herbs in their community, and you know, being doulas, and all these wonderful kinds of knowledge that often in that march to be more Western gets set aside. And also, you know, of course, revitalizing languages, et cetera. And so we're hoping that things can happen in a way which will preserve, you know, what we've learned in terms of tradition, while also learning some of what the West has to offer. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about a data point which you may not know the specific stats about media consumption. You talk about having a cell phone increases media
Yeah.
consumption, which is a logical thing. But I'm curious if you have any insight into what media sources people are consuming, because obviously that affects the narratives and kind of information they have.
Yes, absolutely. So it's varied. Print newspaper is still quite big in these three countries. But of course, internet sources of information are growing rapidly. And in the data sets that we looked at, unfortunately, we did not have the best measures of media consumption, because it was just, do you listen to the radio, do you read a newspaper, and do you watch TV? And so that didn't give us a sense of if they're using their internet connections to get access to the media. But actually, internet connections and you know, phones that are smartphones, that's still a small percentage of the population. So it would be more highly educated women who would have access to those and would be using those sources. Yes.
I'm curious why South Africa doesn't have these statistics that you're using for the three countries you did pick.
Yes.
That's kind of an aside. I have a meta question, maybe I can get to later, but on the neoliberalism aspect, is there any anecdote or is there any way you can characterize how you see that happening? And maybe for the more general audience, what the heck is neoliberalism anyway?
Okay, those are big questions. All right, so in terms of South Africa, they do have data on cell phone use at the household level, but I was using an international data set that I can use to compare multiple countries. And the last time this group collected data in South Africa was 2004, so it's super old. So yeah, that's just for comparability purposes, that's why I don't have South Africa. What is neoliberalism? That's a good question. What I want to say about that is that really, if we almost think about public management, this is how I came at it, and I kind of left that part out of the presentation. If we think about issues of public management and organizing them, so by public management I mean, like, you know, how is access to clean water and sanitation organized, access to good roads, being able to connect to healthcare, that kind of thing. How is that managed for a particular country? New public management approaches use neoliberal, sort of managerialist perspectives that say, okay, we want to be efficient, and you know, this whole idea of these being social goods that are free to everyone, no. You know, what's going to be most efficient is if people are paying for their water, if people are paying for their sanitation, and if we organize this with more market-driven principles as opposed to, as I said, things being provided to people for free. So that's what I was talking about there. Other questions? So the database comes from the Demographic and Health Survey, and so those are free. Oh, yes, it is, yeah. So just send me a note and I'll send it to you. It's still in development. And so far, we've created databases for the three countries here and about 3 other countries. But we're trying to find a platform so that people will have better access to it, and then people can add to it. So I'm working with sites right now and NCSA and folks from the university library to help me to, put it in a format that people can really use. Right now, it's like my Excel spreadsheets that I did on my own. But yeah, just send me a note and I'll send it to you. Yes.
With an increasing number of people owning cell phones, is it becoming more feasible to do foreign aid through direct cash transfers directly to the people of the country?
That's a good question. I think that I would say that it's easier given, many decades of traveling back and forth, and to me it's become much easier. So why do you think that it would be more difficult? What are you thinking there?
It will become more feasible.
Oh, feasible, yes, definitely, yeah. I thought you said more difficult. I'm not listening well. Thank you. Yes.
So I'm curious about the way that you gathered this database, and if you were in communication with the researchers and what their reactions were to your,
Yeah.
and if you were met with any skepticism along the way,
Yeah.
being affiliated with American institutions.
Absolutely. So it's kind of a funny story. So originally, my students and I, collected all these names, and then we started sending emails to them and just saying, okay, we're going to come visit your country. Will you will you let us talk to you about our database, and will you contribute to it? And it was like crickets. We sent maybe 20 emails, and we got 3 responses back. But then once we went to the country and went to the university and started meeting with people, and then one professor would introduce us to 4 of his friends, and then it was just like we got more names in a 1-week trip than we had in months of trying to figure out stuff on the internet and send emails. And so it's been a really positive response so far. I mean, the main awkwardness of it has been that I want to really focus on African women scholars, because I find that even within scholarly circles on the continent, that often women are excluded, especially if their work is feminist or women-centered. And so our male colleagues there are like, you mean you don't want my stuff too? So yeah, but it's actually been very rewarding. Yes.
Question about the database as well.
Mm-hmm.
So at the start of the presentation, you mentioned different epistemologies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if there was anything you were confronted with in building the database that was a type of knowledge that either how it exists or how it's transferred wouldn't fit well within the typical database format.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So because right now we're focused on research-intensive institutions, they're talking the same language we are. If anything, what I'm doing is talking about is more radical than many of my friends there. So I think that that's going to be an issue going forward. Language is going to be an issue going forward too, because right now we're starting with English, but we want to be able to expand to other languages. And so it hasn't become a problem yet, but it'll be an interesting challenge when we get there. Thank you. Yes, Kathleen.
Comments and questions on international funds transfer. The word straight runs into the customer.
Aha.
Terrorism.
Yeah.
Banking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really helping. Other things are Walt's comment about cell phones. Virtually all the adults in Haiti that don't have experience in Africa but in Haiti have cell phones. Many of them are smartphones. That does not mean, however, that the phone is charged, number one.
Yes.
Or number 2, they can receive calls, but they can't make calls because they don't have any money on their phone.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much of a status symbol also.
Yeah.
Finally, mobile banking is taking off in Haiti.
Oh.
The question is about literacy and have you seen any good models that are working in using ICT for education?
Yeah.
It's the jumping the last mile
Mm-hmm.
Virtually all of Haiti now has access to the internet, but it's not being used for education. I'm wondering if you see anything out there that could be applied back to these people.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that the new frontier in terms of education and using internet resources as a part of that is really going to be our new teachers that are coming out of institutions with that, the know-how to do it, the excitement to do it. Unfortunately, some of the older teachers, especially on the African continent, or I'm sure also in Haiti, they're used to teaching in an old way. They have everything set up in a certain way, and they don't want to change. And so the literature just talks about just kind of dragging people, trying to get them to change their teaching methods to really come up with the times. And, honestly, we see that here in the U.S. The new frontier will be definitely new teachers that are coming out who are conversant with the technologies already and really excited about ways that they can use it to excite our kids. Yes, hi.
You talked a little bit about the correlation and causation chicken egg problem with literacy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering on the good governance side of things, did you look at timing of cell phone increases versus these laws going into effect? And is it that the environment is such that there are good laws that make it more likely that women will have cell phones, or is it that women having cell phones sort of led to these laws?
It's a little bit of both. And so, yes, I didn't want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the statistics, but I did test for lag effects of access to cell phones on certain laws. And so for some of them, yes, I did see them coming sort of, after cell phones could have had an impact. But for others, I do believe that, one of the measures was whether or not women were a part of the parliament. And so I think that women being a part of the parliament, obviously it's going to change the conversation about so much in terms of what's going on in women's lives. Yes, Christopher. Yes. Right. Yes. Absolutely. And so he's asking about looking at voice phones in terms of just use of voice and text versus use of the internet, and if women's use of the internet and becoming politically active could cause some security concerns, because sometimes governments want to crack down when women are politically active. And it's really interesting because most of the data sets had information on women's political activity for decades. I've been using these data forever. And now all of a sudden, many of those countries are taking the political activity variable out of the data set. And so I do think that there are some governments with concerns about women's political activity. The data I had, though, was just voice and text. It was not smartphones. Egypt was the only country that I had information for that had smartphones, or information on women on smartphones, but I didn't have information on women's access to smartphones, and so I couldn't use Egypt. So yeah, I'm hoping in the next round of data that I can look at that, because being in the countries recently, I'm seeing that more and more people do have access to smartphones. And you're right, I think that will be interesting to see the impact. But if you think about the election that just happened in Zimbabwe, actually there was less violence. More smartphones and less violence, more political activity, less violence. So fingers crossed that it's moving in the direction we expect. Yes.
Is maternal mortality or morbidity lower in areas with more access to smartphones?
I did not look at maternal mortality and morbidity, and I wouldn't be able to guess that, because I know it's a real problem in Zimbabwe, and that was the country with the highest number of cell phone users who were women. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at that. That's a good question, because one of the variables I did look at is whether or not women had access to health care. And I did find that if they had phones, their own phones, then they had better access in terms of distance to health care was not a problem, so transportation issues were not a problem, and also the ability to pay for health care was not a problem. That was one of my results. So. Okay. All right.
Maybe this
yes.
isn't germane, but
Uh-huh.
I noticed that you publish in race, gender, and class.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the shallow attacks on, if you want to call it intersectionality, but, sort of reducing that to identity politics, or whether you have anything to say about that, whether you get any pushback in any areas yourself.
Yes, well, I guess I haven't gotten a lot of pushback because I'm in pretty safe areas here at the university, but I just think it's important that we take a holistic perspective on what's happening in our social world. And if we look at race issues or here nation separately from what's going on in terms of gender and not look at the ways that those intersect, then we're going to have a partial understanding on what's going on. So yeah, just from a scientific perspective, it's what makes sense, and actually what research shows is actually more predictive of outcomes when we pay attention to those intersectionalities. Thank you.